Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the panel discussion, the University of Michigan Detroit Center's panel discussion on reparations. We're excited here. We're excited today to be celebrating Martin Luther King Day at the Detroit Center in partnership with the Center for Social Solutions. We're really thrilled with the topic that we have today. We think reparations is a subject that has been coming up around the country as different communities explore ways to compensate the descendants of enslaved peoples or enslaved Africans, and also to compensate Native peoples for different acts committed against, egregious acts committed them in early America. We're excited to talk about this topic and thrilled for you all to be here today. We have the pleasure of partnering again with the Center of Social Solutions, and I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator. And before I do that, let me do a quick University of Michigan land acknowledgement. Although we're here in Detroit today, but the University of Michigan being in Ann Arbor, I want to acknowledge that the University of Michigan, named for Michigami, the world's largest freshwater system and located in the Huron River watershed, was formed and has grown through connections with the land stewarded by Niswi, Ishkadowin, and Anishibag, the Three Fires people who were Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, along with their neighbors, the Seneca, Delaware, Shawnee, and Wyandot nations. We are grateful for all that have come before us and given us the opportunity to be here today. And I have the pleasure now of introducing our moderator, Dr. Earl Lewis, noted social historian, award-winning author, and educational leader. Earl Lewis is the founding director of the University of Michigan Center for Social Solutions. Also the Thomas C. Holt Distinguished University Professor of History, African American and African Studies, and Public Policy. Lewis is President Emeritus of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation from 2013 to 2018, one of the premier philanthropies supporting the arts, humanities, and higher education. At Michigan, Lewis and colleagues in the center are addressing 4 core areas of social concern: diversity and race, slavery and its aftermath, water and security, and the dignity of labor in an automated world. Prior to returning to Michigan and before leading the Mellon Foundation, he served as the Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost at Emory University, as well as the Asa Griggs Candler Professor of History and African American Studies from 2004 to 2012. Lewis was previously on the faculty at the University of Michigan from 1989 to 2004 and the University of California at Berkeley from 1984 to 1989. In addition to professorial roles and titles, Robin D.G. Kelly and Esla Barkley Brown Collegiate Professor, he served Michigan as the Vice Provost for Dean of the Rackham Graduate School of Studies from 1998 to 2004. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you one of the first professors I ever had at U of M, Professor Earl Lewis. Thank you.
Thank you for Theodis. It's great to be here, and I want to join in welcoming everyone to this afternoon's MLK program. You can keep the mule. And I am delighted to be able to serve as moderator. The story of reparations in the United States goes back to the era of the Revolutionary War, but gained most note and energy after the Civil War. That war lifted nearly 4 million people of African descent from the category of chattel to claims of citizenship. No longer enslaved, they were ostensibly free to sell their labor to the highest bidder, accumulate capital, start businesses, pursue education, build lives. Except the war ended without an accounting for years served. Land was not promised, back wages were not offered, tools were not given, assurances of help seldom came. Wary of a world that offered freedom but little else, men and women such as Callie House, head of the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association, organized and campaigned for some kind of reparations. Their pleas, however, fell on deaf ears, and worse, many were harassed and arrested for even asking for governmental assistance. It is not that some form of reparations have never been paid in the United States. When the US government incorporated Alaska into the nation, they offered Native Alaskans 44 million acres of land and nearly $1 billion to establish a dozen Native corporations. In sharp contrast, I may add into what was offered Native peoples in the lower 48. And after falsely imprisoning Japanese Americans during World War II, the federal government passed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which included an apology and compensation of $20,000 per individual who spent time in the internment camps. Soon after the passage of the Civil Liberties Act, the late John Conyers, Democrat from Detroit and Michigan, introduced legislation in Congress to establish a commission to study the efficacy of reparations for American descendants of enslaved people. From 1989 until 2021, that measure languished, failing to make it out of committee. As debate was underway at the national level, community-led discussions of reparations emerged in cities such as Evanston, Illinois, Asheville, North Carolina, and most recently, Detroit, Michigan. Today's engagement with reparations stems from the more local efforts to address a question hundreds of years in the making. It is a question for Black and Native communities to be sure, but it's also a question for the nation to resolve as well. We bring this question of community approaches to reparations to you from our roles in the Crafting Democratic Futures project funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. A multi-year effort involving colleges and universities and their communities. The goal is to examine the history of reparations in multiple sites across the nation. And with the belief that community action and community actors, in partnership with academics and others, may succeed in crafting more sustainable visions and plans for a fully inclusive future, one that addresses the matter of social repair. To tackle this important and complicated topic, I'm honored to be in the company of several colleagues, all of whom are involved in the Crafting Democratic Futures project from their domains across the country. We start with Cynthia Spence, who is an associate professor at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, and also professor of sociology. And at Spelman, she heads the UNCF, the United Negro College Fund and Mellon Mays program. And she's also that school's CDF, Crafting Democratic Futures PI. Cynthia, welcome. Next, Tim Eatman, professor of urban education and dean of the Honors in Living and Learning College at Rutgers University. Tim, pleasure to have you here. Tim is the co-PI for the Rutgers-Newark CDF program.
Glad to be here.
Next, I'll introduce Ricky White. He's an Anishinaabe from the Whitefish Bay First Nations in Ontario, Canada, a Native leader, an educator, an activist, and a community fellow for Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. Welcome, Ricky.
Thank you for having me.
Lauren Hood, Detroit civic leader and activist, founder of the Institute for Afro-Urbanism, and one of 3 community fellows for the Michigan site at CDF project. Hello, Lauren.
Hello, Earl.
And then Alicia Ashbury Payne, who's the racial equity officer for Washtenaw County here in Michigan, and another of the Michigan-based community fellows. Alicia, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
We will talk among ourselves for about 45 minutes, and then we'll return to the audience. I will say this now, but say it again, just a logistical piece. Please, when time comes, use the Q&A feature to pose your questions, and they will be collected and curated and be sent to us to answer, and we will try to answer as many as possible in the time allotted. So let's get started. So this is a question for everyone. Reparations is freighted with so much meaning in today's world. Lauren, why don't we start with you? And I want to ask, what do you mean when you use the word reparations?
It occurred to me not too long ago that at the root of the word was repair. So essentially what it means is we are repairing damage caused by past and persistent harms to Black folks. I think what it could look like, however, is a shift in how we approach work in Black communities. I think now the lens is always that there's something wrong with us, that the people are somehow broken and deficient. I think reparations, that first part being an acknowledgement of these harms, allows us to approach work in Black communities from the perspective like, no, it's the system that's broken, not the people. So again, I think it's three parts. I think it's that acknowledgement first, some sort of redress or compensation, and then we need some assurances that what has happened won't happen again. So it's going to require some policy changes.
Thank you so much. Ricky, you want to jump in?
Yes, absolutely. Once again, bonjour. Niga nana kutin digo, bijo hendo dem, not kumigo aniganish na be, ninda, anish na be, ninda. Again, just introducing myself in one of the original languages and one of the Niswe, Ishkutte Win, one of the three fires members that belong right in that land there, and spoke to you in a language that unfortunately is barely known and is on the brink of extinction. And this, in terms of what we are thinking at Concordia College, who selected the reparations and the repair of things that happened and were done to Native Americans as a result of the boarding school policy and the boarding school experience. Where so many of our people were taken from our homes and our families and were put in these schools, and the guise of the schools were intended to eradicate, assimilate, and let's just say annihilate the people. And reparations in that context that we're looking at here at Concordia College, again, right on the border of Minnesota and North Dakota, if you need a landscape and a picture in your mind, is to look at the effects of all of those situations, that historical trauma, once again, that happened, and how we can assist and work with folks that are serving our people right now in our communities to help with healing. And one of the important reparative things right now, just in strategy alone, is that there needs to be more knowing. There are so many people far and wide that have no idea that these schools existed. And I'll point as well to a recent fact. We are now being governed by Representative Holland, the first Native American in the history of our government to be the Secretary of the Department of Interior, which ultimately is the boss of the Native Americans. And she launched recently an inquiry into an investigation into that boarding school experience. And folks, we are going to find more uncovering, and that knowing is again what we are looking at. So I'll share more.
Thank you, Ricky. We look forward, and we'll come back, in fact. Cynthia, your definition of reparations. You're on mute, Cynthia, I think.
Thank you so much for including me on this panel. At Spelman College, we are very much engaged in discussions about reparations, and we're looking at reparations on both the micro level and the macro level. On the micro level, we're very fortunate to be the home of the Truth Racial Healing and Transformation Center. And so we, along with other colleges and universities, are trying to find ways to engage in interracial, interpersonal conversations about race and truth about race in our histories. We are also very fortunate at Spelman to have the Quarterman Keller Scholars Program. And this is on the micro level, really looking at reparations discussions among families, family to family. So we have Randy Quarterman, a descendant of the Quartermans, whose family was enslaved by the Kellers. We have Sarah Eisner, who is a descendant of the Kellers, and these individuals owned the Quartermans. And through their relationship, they've established their own project, the Reparations Project, that really seeks to not only learn their histories, their shared histories, but also to think about ways to expand their knowledge as well as their their ability to lift other families up. So on a micro level, really having cross-racial discussions about race and reparations. But on the macro level, just as my colleagues have mentioned, I'm very much interested in talking about repair. How do we repair the damage that was done to members of it, the enslaved, descendants of the enslaved, as well as our indigenous brothers and sisters? And recognition, there must be acknowledgement that our history cannot be told without including all, not just a selected history of the role of Black and Indigenous people in creating the land that we occupy and the relationships that were developed because of that. And then certainly redress, looking at how we can conscientiously think about how to engage in racial inclusion at all levels, access to capital at all levels, and land for people who were robbed of the fruits of their labor. And so certainly we are most interested in being a part of this conversation as we think about repair, recognition, and redress, but really looking at micro level initiatives of reparations as well as macro.
Cynthia, thank you so much. Tim from Newark. What's the definition of reparations?
Thank you, Earl. You know, I want to build on what my colleagues have shared by saying that I think in some ways it's a realistic awareness that, you know, it's not clear that anything can really ever be repaired. I think that has to be part of what this idea of reparations is and what it looks like. That doesn't mean we need to be despondent. It really is a kind of profound and prophetic imagining in the tradition of Martin King, who we celebrate today, walking in that legacy of staring down the impossible and recognizing that it requires a special kind of work. And MLK, again, is a real light for us because he does not shirk away from the dimensions of faith and spirit that are a part of that work, Earl, and I think it's important. I know that the specific repair of American descendants of slavery to achieve repair from the transatlantic slave trade, chattel slavery, all the things that you mentioned before, the war on drugs, mass incarceration, police brutality, these things are really critical if we are going to have an operational definition of repair and understanding that the myths of white supremacy buttress that. Thanks.
Thank you. Elise, you are Washington County's first racial equity officer, and the word reparations certainly has some currency. What do you mean by reparations?
So in the work in Washtenaw County, we're really looking at this from a proactive systems level approach, understanding that as a government institution, we have a responsibility to actively look for whatever potential solutions and opportunities there are to address the long history and legacy of the oppression of the enslaved. That may look different than some of the community-driven initiatives because we're really focused on how are we allocating resources, how are we creating initiatives, crafting programs and services that provide tangible results in the same way that as a government institution, we directly benefited from the system and legacy of slavery. So one of the things that we've done recently through the Exploratory Committee on Reparations within the county is to look very clearly at who do we have banking in banking relationships with and insurance relationships with, things that don't necessarily seem very exciting. But if you look at the history of these companies and these corporations, many of them, we can trace very clear lines back to how they directly benefited from the enslaved systems. And so addressing our ongoing benefit from those structures from a policy lens is really how we're focusing our work.
Thank you. Thank you all. And so much more to follow. Let me jump ahead in a way. After more than 150 years of social and political agitation, I'm curious, why do you think now the prospects of reparations has picked up so much momentum? I referenced earlier activities on referendum and the vote in Detroit, but also civic commitments in Evanston and Asheville, among others, mayors who have come together to actually talk about reparations and form a group. Tim, let me start with you. What are your thoughts?
Earl, there's a special kind of thing going on in, in Newark, New Jersey. We have, I think, a special kind of community with special kind of leadership that is tuned into realizing the realities of the kinds of things that have mired us and going about ameliorating them in some really creative ways. I'm thinking of our mayor, Ras Baraka, who is very cognizant of the power of the arts as they resonate in the work of community change. And, you know, Earl, my biologists would remind us that bones are always fracturing, always, and really kind of never repaired. And so we really need the osteoclasts, which are large cells that dissolve the bone, and the osteoblasts that come from the bone marrow to repair them. And I think that the arts is like that. And with the kind of ethos like that in the city of Newark at this time, Earl, I think it really meets this demand that we're hearing from our students, our community partners, and a larger society that we must change. We must rise to the occasion. We must stare down this uncouth, pervasive way of understanding society.
Thank you. We'll come back to this. Cynthia, you started by talking about the macro and the micro. I mean, as you sort of expound upon that notion of the micro and the macro, any sense of why do you think now this moment, why after so many years of agitation, we finally seem to be getting some traction? Oh, mute again.
I believe that my system, as we know, has a few problems this morning.
Yeah.
I believe that just as we think about historically the ways in which the social consciousness has been raised, we know that the media has played a big part in that, and that's the print media as well as the visual media. But certainly over the past several years, social media and the movements that have been empowered by young people, just as they were historically, have in fact forced individuals to not put blinders on. That when we look at the visualizations of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, I mean, without technology, I'm not certain how those cases would have ended up. Mm-hmm. But certainly technology, social media, along with the very courageous acts of social movement building of young people, has been very important. And so we are at a particular moment, a very pivotal moment now. And our challenge is, what will we do with this? Because again, we have raised social consciousness in the past, but then we became very complacent. And so our challenge now is to keep the pressure on. And I believe that we have individuals who are sitting around tables now who have in fact assumed certain positions that they can in fact continue to push. And so that's what we have to do, to make certain that individuals realize that we must reckon with our past, because if we don't, we will continue to be challenged by the many, many instances of just unlawful treatment of people, marginalized communities in our society. So again, I credit social media, I credit social movements that have been empowered by young people as one of the as among the key ingredients for where we are now.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Ricky, or at least anything you'd like to add?
Yes, pardon me, Elise. I'd like to add to that the social recognition piece of, the media, the sense of more knowing as a result, I think, of this pandemic, but I think even leading up to it, Dr. Spence made this notion of how there is folks that know about things that have happened. There's such a movement going on. And I think on a Native American perspective, within that context, there have been some unfortunate recognitions that have occurred in recent times. And I'm referring to the start with those 215 mass graves of children that were found at one of these boarding schools and residential schools in Canada. And by the way, folks, that number is now well into the tens of thousands. That type of knowledge all of a sudden awakens folks to, geez, that really happened? And yes, folks, now with, again, Representative Holland, again, our leaders, not afraid to keep digging and keep spreading that message. And I guarantee you, right here in America, there were 367 of these boarding schools across this land. And I guarantee you, now that this investigation is being launched here in America, there will be tens and thousands of children found in mass graves. The reparations for the things that happened, imagine the trauma, imagine the long devastation and legacy that is left. That is now what I call, we are the orphans and descendants of all of those things. This is where, and there lie in the challenges that we have in society today, the poverty, the drugs, alcohol, incarceration, the 40% graduation rates, all of these things, right, that we know are the trickle down of so much of that happens. So I think with certainly the media and with so much knowing, there are some real flashbulb moments that are also really sparking the eye and interest of folks, and it's about time. So,
thank you. Powerful reminder. Elise, you started by talking about the importance of institutions and structures to engage in this body of work. Anything you'd like to add?
I think one of the key takeaways from both of my colleagues is not just that we have more information, but those same young people are now being placed into decision-making roles. And because we have a whole generation that has had more exposure, that has better information and is able to really exchange ideas in real time, what we're seeing is the hitting of a tipping point, where we're moving from an awareness to a social and moral obligation to action.
Great, thank you. Lauren, you have the unusual position of not only working as a community fellow for the Crafting Democratic Futures Project, but also being involved in the whole matter of reparations in the city of Detroit. I'd love to hear your perspective on why Detroit, why now, what has changed?
Well, it's interesting, Earl. You would think as Black as Detroit is at 80% that we'd be leading the nation in this work, but I'll tell you, it feels like we're very oppressed here. And I know there's some people who probably want to fight me. There are a lot of Black people in positions of seemingly power that might have a title, but we're still perpetuating these white supremacist and colonial ideals. And it is very difficult to have a real conversation about what Black folks need, because I think a lot of Black folks here are really worried about their social standing, their jobs, their political clout. So I think that there's something, the social contract that we've all signed up for here doesn't serve us. And I think because we saw the rest of the nation taking action, it made room for those of us working in that space to be a little more bold. Now, that's not to say there haven't been reparations movements here in the past, because there have, but I think that at this moment, they're a little more cohesive and they're connected to the national movements in a way they may not have been before. But I definitely think too, I think Cynthia was the first to talk about the George Floyd and the impact that watching his murder on television had on a global racial equity movement. It got a lot of people off the couch, people who had always wanted to do something but didn't know where to start. But then for those of us who've been in the racial equity space, it kind of leveled us up a notch. It just the way we were talking about it before just wasn't enough. Like myself included, I used to have very, peaceful conversations about racial equity and diversity and inclusion. And after that happened, I just wasn't having it anymore. I'm like, if you can't talk about reparations, I can no longer talk to you, individual, institution, elected official. Just did not have the capacity to have the same kinds of conversations after that moment. And I think that's the same for a lot of people that have been working in the space for a long time.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you all. Before I move on, anyone want to jump back in on this question? Give it half a second, and if not, I'll move to the next. So this session started with a provocative and somewhat evocative title, "You Can Keep the Mule." Cynthia, I'm going to ask, although I know you're not a historian, ask you if you would actually place that in historical context. What's it in reference to? Oh, you're on mute.
I love this title because, the reality is, yes, you can keep the mule because, first of all, most of us didn't receive the mule in the first place. Again, I am not a historian, but love history. And as a social scientist, I have to know history. But, we're talking about Sherman's march, through Savannah and his proud declaration is Sherman's Field Order, Order 15. And it was actually issued January 16th, 1865. So 157 years ago to yesterday. But yet we're still waiting. The order was really executed to settle kind of the newly emancipated enslaved persons who were surrounding Sherman and had in fact assisted with the efforts of the Union Army. The question was, in fact, being debated at the federal level. What do we do once we have the Emancipation Proclamation? Well, what do we do with these newly enslaved people who many thought were empowered, and how might we control them? And as abolitionists engaged in many of the conversations, they said, well, we owe them something. Shouldn't we give them something? Shouldn't they profit from the land that they helped to help build the South on? Sherman decided, as he was approached by members of the government and others, Black preachers in the Savannah, Port Wentworth area, he was approached with, how are you going to provide some level of reparations? And certainly it wasn't called that then. But they decided that 400,000 acres would be divided among about 1,000 newly emancipated slaves. So each one was going to get 40 acres. And Sherman said, I'll throw in a mule. But again, that promise was just to that group of individuals. It was not a promise that was guaranteed to all formerly enslaved persons. We know that also Sherman was really just trying to make a practical decision at that time, not a humanitarian decision. The land that was bestowed upon this group of Black folks is now, the area that we all consider tourist areas for tourism, Savannah, the Sea Islands, and what have you. During this time, Lincoln is still in the presidency. He is trying to determine the best way to remedy the situations that have caused from this new emancipated group of individuals. And we know that Lincoln was, in fact, anti-slavery for very practical reasons. And so he was, in fact, in conversations with others about land reclamation, land redistribution. But we know that Lincoln was assassinated. And then we have, Andrew Johnson, who becomes, the next president. And certainly he was not at all interested in any type of land reclamation. He was more interested in trying to figure out very politically what would be the best decision to make about the Black people, and at the same time keeping his base in order. And so Andrew Johnson revoked Sherman's order. He revoked that order, and he gave the land back to the Southern planters. And that's the last of the 40 acres and a mule. That is the last of it in terms of the federal government doing something to repair the damage that had been caused. And as you say, Earl, there have been many other examples of reparations for different groups. But the last real discussion on the federal government's part about doing something very definitive in the lineage of the 40 acres and a mule, that was it. Johnson said, we're not going to do that. We're going to give this land back to those Southern planters. One of the really important projects that's going on now that we're really excited about is the work of the Reparations Project that is in fact led by Sarah Eisner and Randy Quarterman, where they are in fact trying to do some land redress in that Savannah, Fort Wentworth area. And one of their first grants was to Promised Land Farms, which is in Savannah. And it is considered to be the place where Sharman made that declaration. And so they have actually provided a grant of $10,000 to Promised Land Farms so that Promised Land Farms can, in fact, be serviceable to members of the community. And so again, you can keep the mule. We really never got the mule. The mule was not intended for all of us in the first place. And so that's just a very quick and dirty non-historian discussion of the 40 acres and a mule.
Thank you, Cynthia, and we'll give you a membership card. So don't worry about it. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Elise, as you think about the questions of how we connect the historical past to contemporary concerns, how do you situate them as you think about your daily work and also your work in this project?
So first and foremost, I think it's important in terms of framing, especially when talking to and working with folks who don't necessarily hold the same kind of analysis about why this work is important. So if I work a job and my boss never pays me, I'm still owed that money. If it's next week, if it's next month, if it's 100 years from now, if the conditions in my life deteriorate or are challenged because I was never paid the money that I was owed, it's not because I didn't work, it was that I was never paid. Yeah. And so when framing reparations in the historic context, it's important for especially in terms of government, that the framing is really structured appropriately. We're not seeing new issues necessarily related to chattel slavery. We're seeing ongoing legacy issues that have never been properly addressed. We're seeing compounding marginalizations that have never been properly addressed. And because things were never properly addressed, it is incredibly challenging for the communities that have been harmed to appropriately repair from them. Over the last 2 years, over the course of the pandemic, we saw compounding marginalizations related to inequities tied to economics, to health disparities, to education, things that pre-existed long before COVID, but that were exacerbated by this pandemic, things that frankly existed as a byproduct of the ending of chattel slavery in the United States. And so in terms of looking at the work that we're doing from the government side in Washtenaw County, we're being very intentional in terms of our framing and saying we're looking at addressing harms that were never corrected, that as a system and as an institution, we absolutely have an obligation to address, and that the communities that have been impacted never received any kind of repair to or repair from.
Thank you so much. Ricky, the history of Native peoples, both in Canada and in the US, is different than the history that's related to sort of 40 acres and a mule. How do we begin to think about the whole question on reparations for Native peoples, and given that much longer timeline and a quite different set of historical circumstances?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I guess that we can kind of echo a little more of what was being just shared when we think of treaties, right? Hundreds of treaties that were signed nation to nation only signs treaties. And there were hundreds of these that were signed with Native Americans, and they were all in regards to land, right? You know, the final act of those treaties subsequently was that land would be turned over and I guess reconstituted. I can tell you that none of those treaties have been honored and actually paid for. Right. You know, so there's some reparations in that context. And a recent case in Oklahoma, actually, the Supreme Court said half of Oklahoma is now a reservation because, again, it was recovered illegally. And so they're going through some times in Oklahoma now as a result of that. But folks, when we think about, you know, reparations and we think of those things that have happened, no question, we can, you know, go to 1492 when that guy was lost out in the ocean and landed on the eastern shores and saw these people come out of the woodworks. And because he thought he was in India, he, of course, declared, oh, these are Indians, right? You know, and from that point on, there's been some things that have happened. And, you know, as we think of some of those things that have happened, folks, you know, there's no question there's been devastation. In Canada, they actually went the reconciliation route and used a monetary value for it, where if you were enslaved in these boarding schools or residential schools, you will get $10,000. Okay. And if there were things that happened to you, and I'm talking the physical, emotional, sexual abuses that happened in many of these schools to many of the people that were there, beginning in the late 1800s. And folks, I attended a residential school. The last one closed in 1997. Folks think that, geez, right? Schools of that kind, that's hundreds of years ago. So get on with your life, Native American. Folks, the ongoing piece that happened in regards to these schools is wounds that just don't go away, even with a monetary value. So my aunties got somewhat of $45,000 a piece because they had things done to them. My dad, unfortunately, was not alive, but he had significant things, and that guy died an alcoholic. Okay? It's not just that easy to get on with it. And with that $45,000, they split it up among their kids and bought a truck, and it's gone in a month, folks. And they are still struggling and suffering because what was taken was really the identity, right? The tools that we had as a people to recognize the kind of things that we can do, our ways of life, to allow us to practice these ways so that we can, you know, work through anything. And that, folks, has been one of the greatest atrocities. Where I spoke earlier, this language, there's only 100 speakers left of the Anishinaabe language right here in America, and it'll be gone very soon. And so when we think of reparations at Concordia, we are looking at all of these. We are looking at the historical effects and now the impacts of the current reality that is our homes, not just on reservation, but off reservation. And they are very similar to those folks that have had experiences with atrocities and things committed to them, and now the residual effects of those. And one of the most pervasive things that so much of mankind knows and maybe doesn't want to know are those 6 million, right, Jews that were absolutely annihilated, and the historical trauma that happened with all of those families as a result. And what they are finding is indeed those families also in that genocidal tactic have experienced ongoing trauma. It's not just you know, so easy to move on from. And so in terms of the Native American, it's so related. And just in reading the questions, I too wish there was more collaboration and coalition with our brothers, our Black and Brown people. And I know that that's happening even more. And I think it's just a matter of time now with the social network and the social engagement that's happening, things like this, that word is spread. And I can only speak, you know, in terms of what I know about our Native American families, that there is so much hurt and so much loss that we kind of forget how to empathize and reunite and engage. We're in a fight or flight mode, and I think as things come forward, you know, with reparations and more of this conversation. My hope is that the education piece that comes along with it, that social change, that social knowing is going to result in more action and more change, whether it's policies, practices, procedures. The longevity of those indeed is in how we are going to behave with each other. So that's a big stretch and a big hope that I have. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Ricky. Thank you all. There are so many more questions to ask, but I also promised that we will open it up to the audience, and we got started a few minutes late. But let me, before I do, and that was a cue to everyone who has a question to submit them through the Q&A function. Let me go to each of you and ask you to answer one question in one sentence. And the question is, why must we tackle the question of reparations at this time? Why must we tackle the question of reparations at this time? Lauren, let me start with you.
You would start that big question with me. Well, I think that what folks are starting to recognize is how our outcomes are all connected. I have a couple of clients from my institute that are white-led orgs doing work in Detroit, and they, I think, reached out of fear. Like they were afraid that if they didn't get it right within their organizational culture that they could get canceled. So I'm thinking that white folks and folks who haven't really paid attention to race work in the past are starting to see how it could come to bite them in the ass if they don't start to focus on it. And I think that's, across the board in every sector, people are starting to realize, wait a minute, if that means people won't hire my company to do certain work because we're not as woke as everybody else in our sector is, there are, people are tying it to their bottom line. I think that, and I hate that it has to have such a capitalist basis there, but whatever it takes to get people to the table to have this discussion, I think we need to capitalize on. There's that word again, capitalize. But more importantly, just like socially and spiritually, I think people are starting to understand how our well-being individually is only, we're only capable of that if collectively we're doing well. So it's not just like we have to do this so that Black people, Indigenous people, people of color can get well. It's so that we can all be well. White folks are still not acting in their full humanity if we're living in a world where certain people don't have the same opportunities to thrive. So I think right now it's just really important we're starting to understand how our outcomes are all connected.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. Tim, how would you attempt at a quick answer to why we must tackle the question?
You said one question, and that's unfair. Earl.
I said one sentence, but I
mean, yeah, one sentence. Yeah. I have the pleasure of serving as the dean of a very special project that is interrogating how we do honors. And we have to do this work because young people, like the people that are in the honors living learning community, require that we live up to the aspirations of our institutions, that we recognize the reality that things really cannot be fully repaired, but that there are these dimensions like the arts, which can serve as the osteoblasts and osteoclasts that I mentioned earlier, to help us further along that process. The urgency is critical.
Great. Thank you. Elise, let me jump to you. How would you answer the question?
So I'm going to follow the directions and try and keep it to a sentence. If not now, when?
Great. Okay. Thank you. We'll try to come back and answer that. Cynthia.
I'm going to edit and paraphrase from Martin Luther King Jr. in that we celebrate the anniversary of his birthday today. So all people are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And at this particular moment in history, I believe that unless we learn and seek remedy for past sins of our nation, that we are doomed to repeat them. And so I say that, and I also say ditto to everything that my colleagues have shared. But I believe that we're at a critical moment at this time, and we must seek reparations at all levels that many of us have already discussed.
Great, thank you. And Ricky, your one sentence or so.
If not now, when? Nijwa swe, bema tizewin. Mi giagi nanagatene nanig, abenuchiog. Translation, we think of 7 generations, and we think of our children. If not now, what is the impact on them? As somebody very wise than any of us once said, I would like my children not to be judged by the color of their skin, but the fabric of their character. When can we get to that point? And how can we work towards that? If not now, when?
Thank you all. Theodis, I think, has been collecting questions from those who are watching. So Theodis.
Yes, we have quite a few questions. I don't think we're going to be able to get them all, but we got some good ones. We've been categorizing them by theme, and we're going to start on the first question is, how do you suggest addressing those of the mindset that we need to move on from the past, or that say there are some natives or some Black folks who have succeeded, so why can't everyone else?
To get as many questions on the table, I'm going to let one person answer. So who wants to be the first one to try to answer that question, which is actually like 2 or 3 questions? Elise.
I got my camera off first for this one. So the framing of this as a question of, well, some people have done well despite the conditions. That doesn't change the fact that there is this debt that is owed by our country. That doesn't change the fact that a cornerstone of our economy still continues to benefit every day from the legacy of slavery. And so if we are not addressing that history, we're still failing. It's not a needs-based kind of metric. It's not, do we pay the money that is owed? Do we address the harm that has been done just because a few people have been able to be successful despite the conditions? This is a responsibility, especially sitting in the seat as someone who operates from an institution from the government side of things. The question is really, we owe this debt, period. How do we address it? How do we repair the harm from this debt that's owed?
Thank you. Next question, Theodis.
Next question is specifically for Ricky White. Mr. White, many dark-skinned people are First Nations, but did not submit to the federally recognized groups. Why does the Hollywood version of First Nations continue to represent who can be viewed as being in the community?
How about them Chiefs?
Yeah.
Whoa, 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 whoa. That rendition of one of our songs is garbage, but Hollywood has really trained us well, eh? Old John Wayne and the 6-shot gun and just gunning down about 100 Indians without even reloading, right? You know? I think what the question asked, you know, Theodis, is that lack of recognition. We are also involved in ongoing annihilation of our people to where we are being diluted on paper, folks. That is another lasting effect of so much that was done to Native people, and again, the Black and brown people. So much so that I will tell you this: My daughter right now, okay, she is part Dakota from her mom and part Ojibwe from me, right? I am Canadian, folks, because I grew up on a lake on the Canadian side. I'm Anishinaabe, have so many relatives in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and in America. Folks, these borders did not exist prior. But what still exists is that federal law where my daughter, because she lives here in America, she can only be recognized in one of those nations, one of those tribes. And yes, folks, she is right? Part Dakota. She's also part Alabama Coshada on her grandmother's side. So she actually has to choose one of them. Cannot be enrolled in both, but choose one. And so one of the federal requirements is 25% blood quantum. So she qualifies right on the number. And they chose Alabama Coshada. So federally recognized, she's not even federally recognized as a Dakota or an Ojibwe person, because none of that blood matters. So again, folks, the ongoingness of being recognized, yes, we hear you. And what are her children going to happen, right? What's going to happen to them if she doesn't marry another Alabama Coshada? They're gone. They're not even recognized. So folks, the knowing of all of this, right, is something that is very aware. And I sympathize, and I'm right there with our Black and brown people when they say, yeah, it's hard to be even just recognized within our nations. Something needs to happen, right?
Thank you. The next question falls under the theme of what can we do? What's next? What do you do when your community does a lot of talking about racial equity, but is only willing to entertain reparations conversations in theory or for grant work?
Who wants to jump in there?
Earl, this is Tim. I'll jump in.
Okay.
I think one of the things that you can do is what we're doing with this project. I think it's in some ways an acknowledgement that anchor institutions matter, right? And that we can leverage the opportunity to engage resources and to operate as publicly engaged scholars. Earl, one of my the reasons I respect you so much is because of your understanding of what it means to have work that actually has an ameliorative impact in the world. And that's what this kind of work can do. And I think when we go to from institutions to communities with the right mindset, acknowledging the ivory tower mindset that is so reductive and is so inward focused, and acknowledge community and indigenous-based knowledges, that we can actually move the needle, that we can do as we're doing by engaging the community in dialogues and hearing from them and working with our students to create graphics that we can take into these conversations and conceptual maps and honor the work of community organizers to leverage their knowledge and to move it forward. So I think there's some possibilities. Appreciate this question.
Great. Okay. The next question relates to law and policy. Couldn't you consider the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution as an assurance against a return to the exploitations of the past?
Anyone want to tackle that one? Cynthia, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I would say absolutely not. The 13th Amendment was not enough. The 14th Amendment was not enough. 15th Amendment was not enough. And that we must continue to demand the promises, however, that were guaranteed by those amendments. When we talk about those Reconstruction amendments, but certainly they were not enough, because if we had, in fact, adhere to the promises guaranteed by each of those amendments, I would suggest that we would be in a much better place now. But we have not, as a nation, adhered to the promises that were guaranteed. And so it's up to us to continue, as my dear colleague Tim Ekman says, we've got to continue to organize, we've got to continue to educate, and we must continue to share the message of reparations with the full community, and so that the community uses their knowledge to press politicians and lawmakers to stand firm on the promises that were supposed to have been granted to us as a people. And we know, as we look at what's happening all over the country now, as we look at Supreme Court decisions, that the guarantees that were provided by those amendments are certainly slipping away. And so I would say absolutely not. It's not enough.
If you let me just add, I mean, Cynthia gave a very powerful response. I would add one other piece. If you think of it, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection and due process. The 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote. And then there came Jim Crow and segregation, followed by mass incarceration. So when we talk about reparations, it's not just a story of enslavement. It's actually those three big time periods. It's enslavement, it's the period of Jim Crow segregation, and it's the period of mass incarceration. All three of them have to be looked at in their totality as we begin to really delve into what's at stake here. And what we learn and can glean from looking at that is the conclusion that unfortunately the amendments are not enough because they're each generation, they are subject to interpretation.
Well, that's a great lead into the next question is, how can you determine who should receive reparations, since many of us have been unable to verify our elders' true experience?
Who wants to jump? Who wants to begin to tackle that question? It was a question we were going to get to at some point. We had more time. So, hey, anyone want to weigh in? Who's eligible? It's really a question about eligibility. Who should be eligible for reparations?
Very, very carefully would be an answer to that, but also acknowledge that finally oral traditions are being honored in the scholarship of our study and our work. I think we really need to honor every individual that comes forth with a story that can be validated, certainly through lineage and certainly with the passage of time. But I'll just go in reference to how Canada did it. Again, you want to learn something, go to those crazy Canucks, right? You know, I submitted a form recently because I also attended a residential school. And I'll be honest, I'm a little hard of hearing in this year because of the pulling. And, you know, the strap was very much a natural part. We were lined up at lunch hour. I remember the first time I got that big strap, you know, it was like a line up to the gym. I thought, what are we doing lining up to go see the principal? Well, you're getting a beating today, you know? And so the reparations for that, folks, was a form that I needed to fill out and describe my experience, which has then gone forth to be evaluated and regulated. And again, for me, the healing began just in going through that process to some degree. I remember my dad, who's not here, and I remember the reasons why he told me that he was an alcoholic. And he told me, son, I wake up, you know, when I close my eyes at night and when they wake in the morning, the worst nightmare of guilt hits me because I could not protect my younger brothers and sisters from the things that were being done to me that I know was also happening to them. And so I wish he had a chance to share more of that and go through the process. But reparations on a monetary end, again, is just only the beginning. It is really only the beginning.
And Theo, this is going back to the point I was making earlier, which Ricky picked up in his comments. I mean, part of it is also how you create an understanding of the temporal context. If it's only a story about the period of enslavement, then the question is about, are we only talking about the descendants of enslaved peoples in the United States? It's an open question. But if we're moving into the period of Jim Crow, or if we're moving into the period of mass incarceration, then that opens up a whole new set of questions about eligibility. And and in each of those periods, there are ways in which I think we can begin to recontextualize who's eligible. Because as we know, for anyone who is a descendant of West Indian immigrants to the United States, it's not like slavery didn't exist in the West Indies, and that somehow that story is different and part of a different political economy than the one that dominated in the United States. And so it's complicated, it's important, it's essential, but it should not be the thing we stumble over.
Hey, Earl, can I just jump in real quick?
Sure.
Just quickly, one of the critical aspects of reparations work I've learned is about documenting harms.
Yeah.
And I think that when we talk about eligibility, it's really critical for us to realize that historical work, I was so delighted by Dr. Spence's articulation of the historical context in general, but these local communities have an opportunity to really look at the impact of redlining, the impact of public health issues and education, and really to stack that against the question of eligibility. And I just wanted to inject that.
The next question falls under challenges and pushback. What is your response to middle and lower class white people who wonder why they should give up their money and resources for historical decisions that they did not make and don't directly see how they benefit from the oppressive system?
Who wants to tackle this one? I know I have an answer, but who else here wants to tackle this one? Elise?
So again, I think this goes to looking at it from a systems and structure level perspective, right? We're not just talking about individual harm that happened between two families, although that is a component of what we're talking about. We're talking about a time period in American history where you had the entire economy, our entire social structure built around this particular framework. America, as we know it, would not exist without this history and this legacy. And so looking at it from the structure of systems and the system responsibility in terms of making repair, I think is really important context and framing. I think it's also a fundamental question about what privilege is and what privilege is not. And sometimes privilege looks like you didn't experience certain kinds of things, or your family was not subject to certain types of behavior or certain types of harm because of your race. Not that you received an additional cash compensation, but you weren't necessarily concerned about your family being split up and sold because of race, right? And so your experience today doesn't have that same history, doesn't have that same legacy. When we start going into Jim Crow, and we start going into mass incarceration, and we start going into the economic wealth gap, we're still continuing to see examples of system level negative impacts on communities based upon race, based upon indigenous ancestry, things that, a person who identifies themselves or is white and doesn't have that history, they may not individually be responsible, but our system as a whole is. And so really framing it in terms of those levels of interventions.
Can I add one thing to that as well?
Sure.
I also want to take the emotional labor off of Black folks to make the case for reparations. So that would be a call to action to institutions and those who consider themselves allies to make that case. Like, we've done enough. We're tired. I would say the least allies can do is be making the case to those people who have doubts and questions.
Yeah. Thank you. And I realize technically we have 3 minutes left. And so I don't know if we want to pose another question. Theodis, I turn to you.
I think since we started late, we should go just take one more before we wrap up. And
Okay.
This one, could the panelists please discuss the ideas around self-same land, looking at the relationships that exist among indigenous peoples and Black peoples in the United States, and what that might actually mean when it comes to coalition with these groups?
And what was the first part of that question again? I'm sorry.
I'm not, could the panel discuss the idea around self-same land? I'm not
Okay.
sure what that means, but I thought someone might.
Anyone able to tackle that question?
Okay.
And then there was a second half of that question about coalition building, right?
I believe, and I'm addressing the second half of it. I believe that coalition building is very important, particularly as we look at the kind of shared histories of land dispossession for our indigenous Native American communities, but also the ways in which we as a people of African descent who were in fact enslaved here in the US, actually cultivated the land for profit for this country. We provided our unpaid labor. And so there is something to be said about how do you repay that labor? And again, as we talked about the 40 acres and a mule, that just didn't work, right, for most of us. So I do believe that we should, in fact, build coalitions. And certainly this project is helping us to do that as we're learning more about our shared histories and really using that knowledge to actually build coalitions that can, in fact, inform social movements. So I do believe that there is a place for coalition building across groups that have suffered the history of the US in the ways that we have, but others certainly have something to share.
Thanks, Cynthia. Anyone else? I mean, the challenge here, and I'm not sure I fully understood the question, but the challenge here is indeed also coming to fully appreciate and understand the depths of the land question in American history and how we unravel it. And rather than giving the history lesson I'm inclined to give, I'll just leave that as a teaser for another time when we come together to talk about this question of reparations.
Well, I'm going to stop there. We got over 70 questions. We're sorry we couldn't get to them all. We're very grateful for everyone for submitting your questions. We will be providing a transcript and we will be providing some documentations, and this session has been recorded and will be up on the Detroit Center website soon. But Earl, you want to get any final thoughts from our panelists before we go?
Man, in some ways, I think if I go back and ask for another sentence, I'll get it. So let me close out this way on behalf of everyone involved in the Crafting Democratic Futures project. We started this project because we came to believe that while the federal government may ultimately have to play a role, that we also know the social change in the United States never comes just because someone in Washington believes it's a good thing. Historically, we can turn to the fact that there are actors in communities across this country that have risen up at various times to push this country to change. And so if we're going to get to the question of reparations finally, it's not just because HR 40 finally got out of committee and the hard work of the late John Conyers and Shirley Jackson Lee, among others, is finally starting to prevail. Is because other people are asking questions in communities such as Detroit and Evanston and Nashville and a growing list. But here's a case where what's been on display is something Tim Eaton noted, that intellectual work is not the province of those of us who happen to sit in the academy. There are people all over this country looking a way to create and develop a vision of this country that is more equitable and that is more inclusive. I mean, it is the hope of this project that we can aid that effort by actually delving into the histories of 9 communities around the country as they work to unravel and uncover their own past and ask questions about what should change at the policy level, what should change at the social level, and how does that actually lead to repair. As Ricky White noted, money in and of itself is one part of the answer, but money in and of itself doesn't necessarily eliminate the legacies of trauma. And so how do we begin to think about repair, and as Lauren noted at the beginning, acknowledgement and redress as some part of that. And so the systems that Elise referred to, the macro and the micro examples that Cynthia referenced at the outset, all of this is part of the interweaving of the Crafting of Democratic Futures initiative. And what I didn't say and what we didn't say is that ultimately we're also producing a PBS style documentary, WQED, out of Pittsburgh. And so at the end of this 3-year effort, we want to not only chronicle what has happened in each of these communities, but also to set the nation on a course of discovery, debate, and hopefully some kind of resolution. And so we thank you for being part of today's panel, for engaging us in questions, and we will look at the 70 and try to see if we can get answers to them. And if we can, we will try to post them in some way in a site that can be reviewed. We want to thank Theodis and his colleagues at the Center for inviting us to be a part of this effort. And as we close out this MLK event, we're reminded that indeed there is no short change for leadership. The idea is that we celebrate this day in part because in another time, in another place, another generation of men and women took to the streets, armed themselves in the ballot box where they could, and they actually insisted that there be some change. That work is never ended. We're now on to this next chapter. And here we are looking to do work with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Earl. Thank all the panelists for your time and energy.
Thank
We
you.
really appreciate our audience for bearing with us and being patient while we dealt with some technological issues. You know, technology is only good when it works. Again, we thank you all for spending your day. You had a lot of options on MLK Day. We appreciate you being here with us. Again, I'm Theodis Ship with the University of Michigan Detroit Center. We ask that you check out our podcast, Distinctly Detroit, and check out our upcoming programming as well. And I bid everyone a great MLK Day. Have a wonderful afternoon.